Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the next in our local Heroes interview series. My name is Kimberly Bolero, and I'm the director of the Holocaust Education Resource and Outreach Center, or better known as the Hero Center. This is a joint initiative between Voices of Hope and the Maurice Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Hartford. We hope that this finds each of you well, healthy and safe in these times, and we thank you again for joining us in conversation this afternoon. If you have any trouble viewing this conversation, we suggest refreshing your browser, and please know that it is being recorded and we will make it available afterwards. We thank you in advance for your patience for any technical difficulties that may occur during the conversation. Please note that if we do lose the live stream, we will come back just a couple of minutes later, and we will be back as best we can. Today we are talking with author Barbara Bergren, who has just published her first book, Witness for My Father. This is based on her father's experience during the Holocaust. Barbara has spoken to many student groups in schools in Connecticut and is truly making her mark in Holocaust education in the state. So please join me in welcoming Barbara. So hi, Barbara. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hi, Kim. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it, and totally delightful all the time.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so excited that you're here with us today. And please, if any of our viewers have a question or a comment for Barbara, please leave it in the comments, and we will try and get to them throughout the conversation. So, Barbara, we'll start with you. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay. Thank you again, Kim. I'm really happy to be here today. I have a slide up just on, this is the book that was published this year, Witness for My Father. And I'm going to use my pointer. I think you can see. That is my dad. He is a Holocaust survivor. And that is me at around age 6. And this is a World War II story. You can see about loss, hope, and discovery. But I thought it'd be nice for you to post also a book of when we were adults. So that's part of the, and I'm going to, you want to know a little bit about me. All right. So that is a picture. This is actually my mother, Margareta. This is me around age 2, I believe. And this is my dad. He was born Mieczysław Weigensberg, and here we are. I was born in Israel, and so my dad's name there was Moshe.
Okay, Barbara, could you continue, please? We're very sorry about that. If you could go back just a little bit, that would be wonderful.
Okay, we'll stay on this slide. Yes, Kim?
Yes.
Okay. Kim had asked me a little bit about myself, and this is my family. I was born in Israel, and that is my mom on the left, and that is me at about age 2, and that is my dad. And you know, you have these pictures in your home for a long time, but you never think about it. But one thing I noticed when I was beginning the research for the book is that there's an insignia on my dad's lapel here, and he was actually in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, back in the early 50s. So that is a little bit, my parents, obviously my parents came from Europe, and obviously very supportive of my education. So I was very fortunate to go to college, and then they supported me to get my MBA. And I ended up working in the finance accounting, the finance field and healthcare finance as a specialty group So I worked, and something that kind of comes back is that I got my MBA at the University of Hartford. So it's full circle that the Hero Center is located there.
Okay, wonderful. Well, could you tell us maybe a little bit about your family and where they came from?
Sure. My mom here on the left was born in Germany, and she was born in the Bavarian section north of Munich in a town called Bamberg, which is actually a UNESCO site now. It's a sweet little town. She grew up on a farm. My dad was born in Poland, and he was born in a town called Starachowice, and there's a suburb of it which is hard to pronounce, but I've learned Werschnik, and that was really the Jewish suburb of Starachowice. So I'm going to get a little bit more into that piece of history later on. How's that?
Okay. All right, wonderful. So one of the questions that a lot of students have specifically for survivors is, when did you start talking about this? And I think this is a really important question for their children as well. When did you start learning about your family's history, and what was this effect in continuing to learn about it?
Thank you. I'm trying to manage the slides here.
You're doing a great job.
Thank you. Actually, as a young girl, I always knew that Dad was a survivor, but I didn't really, when you're young, they didn't talk about it. My father was one of the people, and I hear there are many who don't really share a lot of their history. And my defining moment actually came, I think I was in third grade, and we had come to the United States. Going back a little bit, we lived in Israel, we lived in Germany for a short while, and we immigrated to the United States when I was 6 years old. And again, about third grade, they had one of those old newsreels, and it was on World War II. And they had a segment on concentration camps. And for the first time, I looked around and I said, this is really unusual. No one else was at attention the way I was, and clearly it creates a more serious note. So we had, that time was the first time I realized that I was even more different, not just that I was, had immigrated to the US, I was even more different. And then later on, I think one thing about being a 2G, they call a second generation, is I've always felt a serious tone because, you know that your parent or parents, I only have one parent survivor, went through a torturous history, and you live with that. And I adore my father, always adored him. So it became part of, I always tried to protect probably the strongest man I know. And then in the last 2 decades of my life, things changed dramatically, where more information came into play, and I think we're going to get into that. But in the last 2 decades, I took a few years to write my book, but it all started in around 2001. And so actually that's just to go into the next, you're on, Kim.
Yeah, of course. And so that naturally leads us to, what is it that prompted you to write this book on your father's story?
I always knew, because of the depth and breadth of the story, I always knew I was going to write something. And my parents have a unique history. It encompasses, and we were through 3 continents, for me at a very young age. But then one day in 2001, I was working with my dad at his business, which I worked at part-time, and he had said someone was looking for him. And he didn't know who it was. And I said, well, you know, I'd be happy to make a phone call. He had a phone number, but the name didn't look familiar, not to me. And my dad had a hearing aid at the time. So he said that day to me, he said, let's make the phone call. And quite frankly, that phone call changed my life. It changed his, but it changed my life because the phone call was from a gentleman whose name was John Withers. And we had a name that looked like Wickers. And so I said, I think you're looking for my father. And so we ended up having quite a phone call. I'd never heard that name. I'd never heard about him. And he said, I've been looking for you, Martin, to my dad on the phone for 2 years. And so I'm flabbergasted. I don't know what's going on. And so they discussed, and he made a comment. He goes, do you remember what the troop called you? And my father says, PV immediately with a Polish accent. And he said, right, it's Pee-wee. So it turns out my father said, in fact, immediately said, is your father Lieutenant John Withers? And this is John II, said yes. And I have no idea. So he talks about the history of this 2-year search. He grew up on my father's story, and clearly I did not grow up on that story. And at the end of the phone call, we said, okay, we're going to meet. So that comes in, I'll tell you a little bit more about that after. But that was a defining moment. It did change my life.
Okay, so that's a really nice cliffhanger for anyone who is looking to read the book. There is this monumental moment in Martin's life that has prompted all of these events, even to today. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about your father's experience. There we go. Maybe without giving too much away about what we'll read in the book, but maybe you can give us a little background on his experience.
I'd love to. Thanks, Kim. This is a picture I thought Kim had mentioned, to be prepared to talk a little bit more about the family. And this is a picture taken around 1931, and the far left is my father at, I think, about age 4, making quite the fashion statement. This is his mother, who is my grandmother, and her name is Sonia, and I was actually originally named after my grandmother, Sonia. In her lap is my father's sister, her daughter, Clara, with a K, and the gentleman on the right is my grandfather, dad's dad, Isaac, and with a K, because even in the book there is another Isaac. The book actually brings you back to a time where you meet the family. You actually feel the normalcy of living in Starhowitze. By the way, there's the spelling of that, because people ask me now. And it takes you through their normal time, and then we end up in New Year's Eve, and again, a normal New Year's Eve, but that really launched a new year, it was New Year's Eve, 1938. And in 1939, after a normal summer, the Nazis invaded Poland, and you really get to feel and see the changes that came about very quickly, starting with some of the rules they imposed. And so we follow the family through into the ghetto, and some of the changes there. All of that went, in a sense, you can follow, not easy, but they were together as a family. And then in 1942, early 1942, around January, it was in January, there was a Wannsee conference where the Nazis got together and created something we all know called the final solution. And their final solution was to just kill off the Jewish population. You're going to hear me. I don't like to use the word exterminate. I feel I call it like it is, which is murdering or killing. And so in 1942, they actually put a unit together, SS units that did like cookie cutter, went all around Germany and, into Poland and other areas once it, but predominantly there. There were 6 million Jewish people killed during the Holocaust, and half of them came from Poland. So the story that I write about is very similar in some of the other towns, because it was actually, they came in, it was brutal. And what happened there is they were forced out of their homes in the ghetto, and they were separated, men, women, and separated between who would work and who would not, and who did not work went off to a transport. So that day, October 27th, was a day that obviously changed my father's life, and he lost his mother and sister that day. We follow my father and his father, my grandfather, through 2 years of slave labor camp in the town of Starhowitze. What set that town apart is they had a factory, and that factory, when the Germans took over, they transformed it into a munitions factory. So it became an important part for the war effort. And it is one of the reasons I believe Starhowitze endured longer during the war. However, as we know, through history, the Russians, who the Germans had also attacked, they were now coming over the front. We're now in 1944. The Russians are advancing, and the Americans, as of D-Day, came into the picture of the war as well. So in 44, late July, anyone left who had survived the slave labor camp under horrific conditions was transported to Auschwitz. So my dad and his father arrived in Auschwitz in 44, and then he was there through the death march. He was transported. I do want to stop there a second. My father and his father had actually worked and suffered together for 6 years from the invasion to Auschwitz now. But they were separated for the first time there because there were subcamps. There's like 45 subcamps in Auschwitz. And unfortunately, he lost his father there. But he was placed in one of the subcamps called Monowitz, Buna. Buna is rubber. And Elie Wiesel, which will kind of come into play a little bit, but Elie Wiesel, the author of Night and obviously famous author and speaker that I got to meet once, Elie Wiesel was in the same subcamp. Now my dad is 16 years old, so is Elie Wiesel, and they were in the same subcamp. They were then the death march to a place called Gleiwitz, and from there they were transported to Buchenwald. After Buchenwald, my father, now on his own, was put on a transport that actually went through over 2 weeks, no food or water, and ended up again trying to stay ahead of advancing Russians and the Americans coming in, and ended up in Dachau. And only out of 5,000, only about 800 survived that transport. My father was one of them. So Dachau starts a brand new era. He was there for a short time. He was liberated on April 29th, very special day, 1945. And that started a new journey for my father. We'll leave it at that for now, Kim.
All right, thank you so much for that. It's such an incredible journey, and we see these parallel journeys happening with many of our local survivors. And as you said, also Elie Wiesel. Maybe if we have some time later, you can tell us about that experience with him. So at the top of the book jacket of your book, Witness for My Father, it reads, "A Jewish survivor and a Black troop are determined to prevail over genocide and racism." Why is this such an important part of your father's story? And you alluded to this a little bit earlier.
Okay. Yes, thank you. We're coming. A lot of the story comes full circle. Getting back to the phone call, John Withers, who made the call, John Withers, it ends up, I didn't realize, but my father that day, and I'll take you back to the call because that was a defining moment. My father, I looked at him after the phone call and I said, "What on earth is going on?" And my father he was a soft-spoken man and very kind, but he just got up from his desk and he kind of put his head down and put his hand behind his back and just kind of straightened up. And he said, "Barb," he called me Barb. He said, "They put me back on my feet." So it turns out that John Withers was the lieutenant of an African-American troop, an army troop. And he and his men, my father, after he was liberated from Dachau, made another life-changing decision, and he left. He was placed in a displaced persons camp, a DP camp, and chose to leave. So he was orphaned, 16, homeless, weighing 90 pounds at 16. And he literally walked until he found this army unit and was trying to converse with them because he couldn't speak their language, that he could work for them because he wanted to earn his own way. And what he didn't know was that that particular troop, which is the 3511th Quartermaster Truck Company, they were a supply company, and the African-American troops were segregated from their white counterparts. And which in itself, I don't know, that to me that was just so surprising, but they were segregated as well. And when this group of this troop came from the Deep South, so these were really burly men who knew and had suffered discrimination. They came into the camp to bring supplies, and they were so transformed. They had never seen anything that horrific. And actually, I found a lot of quotes because I had done some research. And one of the quotes that kind of, and I did speak at a school 2 days ago, actually, a high school, and I share some of these quotes. And this one is Leon Bass. He's a African-American soldier. And his quote was, and actually this is a Buchenwald, but still the same. He said, I came here angry at my country because they're treating me differently. You know, I'm fighting for my country and they're treating me differently. And then he said he walked into the camp and he said he was facing evil. And then he suddenly had an aha moment of, this isn't just about me and myself. He realized he was staring at evidence of racism. So these men that my father approached actually at a fence knew exactly where he came from because they had been inside the camp gates. And there was a rule, the Army could not take former prisoners of war for work or anything because there was, diseases were running rampant. They weren't sure how former prisoners of war would react, and they were in such a bad state. What this troop did was they took him in, they tried to feed him, they wanted to take care of him, and another young Jewish boy also approached my father a few days later and asked if he could maybe be part of that. And my father talked to the men. Again, he's still broken, doesn't speak English, but they ended up taking these two Jewish boys and hid them inside the unit. Well, the lieutenant came back. He was gone for a few days. And Lieutenant John Withers came back, found out that his men were hiding. And he was going to get his PhD with the GI Bill. And he also was very protective of his company because Black soldiers had to keep their noses very clean. And he did not want to put anyone in jeopardy. And he was by the way, another really kind man. The end was, he said, I have to send them back and bring them to my office. And I won't tell you too much, but he made a decision to keep them. And so my father, here on the right, he was maybe 16, close to 17. They hid the boys. And the joke from John Withers was, how are we going to hide two Jewish boys in a Black troop? Like you can't see them? And so there's a lot about how they did that, how they accomplished it. But the truth was they were adopted into a Black family. And what they did was they nurtured my father back to health, emotionally and physically. And they did that for over a year. So that becomes part of the heart of the story. Also, that ended up morphing. After the phone call, we had agreed to try to meet because they hadn't seen each other for 55 years. So 55 years later, 3 weeks later, on April 27th, which is the day my father got to Dachau, we went to the airport, and these are the two men. There's John, my father, and myself at the airport, and they reunited. That story actually morphed in a tremendous way because first of all, we spent a couple of years. They came to my daughter's wedding. We really became like an extended family. And it morphed to a point, it actually made, was a Wall Street Journal article and then some, but we should probably move on because the story goes on from there. And not all of it is even in the book because so many things came out of that time. And again, this is the year 2001, a real changing point. So back to you, Kim.
Wonderful. And these photos they're just beautiful. I think being able to see these young men in 1946 and then again 55 years later, it is truly a wonderful story. And it's incredibly timely that your book is being published in a time when Holocaust memory is fading, and we see an explosion of outrage over our own history of racism in America. And so, what do you think this book can offer readers in this very historical moment of unrest?
It is amazing that who knew that we were in the last 2 weeks. Part of the heart of the story comes to life there too. There's a lot of lessons. I'll tell you, after I became aware of my father's story that he never talked about either, this post-Holocaust era, it made me want to be a better person. Somebody reached out to help my dad, and I always wondered how he survived as a kind and non-bitter person after everything he had been through. And my father taught me, and I think this goes to the heart of your question, never to judge people clearly by religion, by race, by culture, tradition, but always to judge them by character. And if you think about his story, and there's one incident, and I think this speaks to any type of racism. In the camps, there was a Turkish Muslim young man who my father didn't know. Remember, they were all different countries thrown together in these camps. And they hadn't really known each other. They were, I think, it could have been bunkmates that night. But he shared a piece of bread with my father because within his faith, you always shared, you always took care of others. And it doesn't matter that the difference, it's about being human beings. And quite frankly, I want to be an anthropologist. I really believe all people are good people. And then you have I call them bad apples or extremists, and they create an awful lot of havoc. But that's what they are. They're a minority, and they create and they make the news, unfortunately. But overall, it's about just getting back to basic humanity. And what we just saw again is everything is to balance back. We're all, you have to get beyond it, and you judge by the character of people and certainly not by the others. So I thought that was a good lesson I've always carried with me. So thank you for that question.
Oh, that's beautiful, and I think it's so, as I said before, it's very timely that we're having this discussion, and that we're talking about how your father as a Jewish Holocaust survivor is being, I love the word that you used, nurtured by a minority in America that was being persecuted in their own country as well. So I haven't been able to see you speak in schools yet, but I imagine that these are the types of lessons, and this is the kind of information you are imparting to students when you speak to them. And so I'm wondering, in your experience of speaking with students, what have you seen or experienced with regards to the impact of learning about the Holocaust and other genocides? What is the impact on students or on educators, the community at large? Can you maybe speak to that experience?
Sure. I've been doing it a few years, and my first experience was in a junior high school, which I was almost a little nervous. Junior high, they had read Elie Wiesel's book Night, which is about Auschwitz, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, they're 8th graders. What I learned by speaking to the schools is, first of all, I am so impressed with the kids of today. I'm so impressed. And in this junior high, in fact, I share with them, it's really the message is about anti-bullying. The message is upstanders is a common theme these days, but and that's something at some point I'd like to get into a different way. I think we all need a new approach to strengthen that. And what I do is I go through a little bit with the map and show them, because the one thing, I'm going to revert here, I've read some studies that said a lot of the kids today may not even have heard the word Auschwitz, one of the largest killing centers during the war. A lot of them didn't know much about the Holocaust. That is not their fault. They haven't learned it. And it really is up to the educators. I'm amazed at the schools that took, before it became a mandate in the state of Connecticut, and now we have another one in the country, which is a big step forward for humanity. But I tell it as it's a story about one person, and I try to make the 6 million people, which is so difficult for anyone to grasp. I mean, what is 6 million? And of course, there were 11 million killed. And so I take, like, I'll say the state of Colorado, if you wiped out the entire state and every single person in it, that's 6 million, just to give them an idea. But this is the story about one person. And that's what resonates. And when they leave the auditorium, they understand the names of the camps, what they really mean, but they understood it through the eyes of one person, and he's my dad. I do need to just say this, I know it's understood. The survivors, they're in awe of survivors. They're in awe of anyone who has gone through this experience, and they do a remarkable job speaking with the kids. They also educate the teachers, I'm sure. And now, because I used to say in a decade, we won't have as many survivors speaking, but the truth is, I'm talking about my adored dad, and it resonates and they understand. And I think it'll go on to the third generation at some point, 3Gs. Overall, and I'll tell you one comment and then I'll hand it back to you. The comment in junior high school, and I loved being there because they actually helped me even. I was talking about the title for the book. My first title, by the way, which I knew wouldn't make it, was The Power of Kindness. The theme of the book is power of kindness and hope in a hopeless situation. The kids resonate with that. They get that because they're what they go through in their lives. And I just lost, I was going to make one point. Oh, the comment from the young gentleman. So this young boy raises his hand and he says to me, "This must have been very emotional for you to research and to write." I'm impressed with the kids, very, very much so.
It's something we see with groups. I think each time I witness a group that speaks with a survivor or with a descendant, how deep some students make those emotional connections and show this level of empathy for other people's experiences. It's really a wonderful thing to witness. And so through then all of this, what message would you have for our students and for future generations?
I'm going to bring up the last slide here that I show when I work with the students. I want to make sure I'm going to move us. Okay, there we go. This is Dad with his great granddaughter on his birthday. And I'll get back to my logo there. The students today, and I make, again, when I spoke on Tuesday, and I really drive this home because I believe this, they are our future. These students are our future. They are going to make a difference. They're going to be in charge of our country soon, which means they will impact the world. And I feel very strongly about empowering their mindset because they really are, and especially in high school and seniors, they're an important part of their lives. They're about to step into that role very soon, and voting and deciding how they want their country to look. The other thing that we talked about with the students is, for the first time, and as I did the program, and you can't ignore this, our COVID period, these students have never before really lived through something like this. And I made a bit of a parallel for when the country was occupied, when Poland was occupied, how they now understand, at least despite very different, this is invisible, this is keeping people safe. But for example, you couldn't go to school. You can't play sports. You can't go outside like you normally would. You can't see your friends. Curfews, they are living it. They've never lived this before, but it was a glimpse of the feeling of not feeling you have your rights at the moment. Now, this was to keep you safe, so just to make sure that's clear. And the other message is, so never take anything for granted. That was one of my father's favorite lines. Don't ever take anything for granted. And clearly, I understood that very well. So the students, it did resonate with them. They are, I will tell you, I have never had any issues. It's quiet. They listen to the stories. They're immersed. I've had people come up after. One young woman had tears in her eyes. She just got it. And I think she had a relative that lived abroad. And so again, just bringing one person's story, the survivor, and the story as we know, this is about basic humanity and the future and obviously about discrimination. And by the way, we are still friends with John Withers and his family, even though we've lost our dads. My favorite line is, this is new, you'll see it when I'll post it on my website, but humankind can conquer all. And so this particular word, humankind, is really the thrust of speaking with the students. As far as you mentioned, educators in the community, they're all on the same wavelength. I think they need to hear the stories as well. And that's the only way we are going to pass the story along. So I have just one closing. We can and we can still talk, but this is my dad, more recent witness for my father. He is the main character. And this is the Dachau Memorial, and in many languages, it's never again. And so I thought that would be a nice last slide anyway for us.
Absolutely. This is a gorgeous photo of your father. How old was he at this point when you went back?
During the reunion?
So here in this photo at Dachau,
Okay.
when was this again?
Okay, when this photo was taken in Boston, and this is a photo of him in his early 70s.
Okay.
So I just wanted, at least to see him in.
So it's just it is just a beautiful photo of him.
And
oh, wow.
And his just a little bit to bring you back the story of if there's any interest in reading it. The Wall Street Journal did a wonderful job, but because someone had heard of the story and then Wall Street caught it, and actually Reader's Digest, it's gone all over. It was on CNN. They asked Brian Gruley asked me if he could interview our dad, and so my brother. By the way, my brother was born in the United States, but my brother and I talked to my dad, and we figured he was a very private person. We figured he would not want to do the interview. This is like major, and a lot of people didn't even know his history. So when he did the interview, suddenly he was full stage, and unfortunately he passed right before it went to print a month later. So there's his legacy is there, and the article was changed because he had just passed away, but it really is about John, Lieutenant John, and my father, and it takes you back through his history in the article. I'll tell you, the feedback for the story is consistently that people are moved by the kindness and want more of that type of, I think the world needs it, wants it, needs that kind of support from each other. So that's the, I think that's, a good point in closing on the theme of what I hope the book portrays. And it's, it's been really a pleasure, and I'm learning every time that we do this. I learn, from others, the questions. They're astounding and very. I do book clubs too, and the book clubs, the questions have been making me really think about my own history. One day I said it's like a therapy class, so it's really been a wonderful adventure. So I didn't know if you had any more questions. I'm going to take the picture down.
Sure.
Is that okay? All right.
Yes. Well, we are just about out of time, but if anyone would like to know more about Barbara, you can visit her website at barbarabergren.com. I will put that in the comment section here, and also a link to how you can purchase the book, Witness for My Father. I would just like to thank you, Barbara, so much for spending time with us today and sharing your story and all of its heartfelt and extremely relevant lessons for today. It's always a pleasure working with you, and I hope our readers will go out and read this really important book. We'll share the link to purchase the book in the comments. Thank you to everyone who has joined us today. We had some local viewers from Bristol and Simsbury and West Hartford, and our furthest viewer, a good friend of mine, Martina in Germany, who is always following us. So we thank everyone for their support of our series and the Hero Center and Voices of Hope. It's always wonderful to see our local and international supporters supporting what we do. So please note that Voices of Hope is also hosting a summer speaker series starting next Tuesday, June 16th. Each Tuesday evening, we will be bringing you conversations on various topics related to the Holocaust. This will be every Tuesday evening in June and July. Next week, we will be speaking with journalist Helen Epstein on the publishing of her mother's memoir, Francie's War. So be sure to register for that Zoom conversation. And we'll put up the full series as soon as it should be any moment, actually. So again, Barbara, thank you so much for your time, and we hope that you and your family stay healthy and safe, and we hope to work with you again very soon.
Thank you so much for having me today, and really it's always a pleasure and working with you. So thank you so much, Kim. I really do appreciate it, and thank you to the Hero Center and Voices of Hope, because they do a phenomenal job. I really appreciate it. So thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.